When most people picture German armor in World War II, they don't see the workhorses. They see the celebrities. The massive Tiger, looming out of the smoke with its thick armor and long 88. The sleek Panther with its sloped plates and deadly gun, prowling like a big cat on steel tracks. In museums, games, and films, these are the stars of the show, the machines that seem to define German engineering, German power, and German legend. But behind those myths, another tank quietly did most of the actual fighting. It rolled into Poland in 1939 and was still fighting outside Berlin in 1945. Crossed deserts, forests, and frozen plains. It was upgraded, tweaked, stretched to its limits, but it never left the stage. That tank was the Panzer IV. In this episode, we're going to put the legend and the workhorse side by side and ask a hard question. If Germany had devoted less effort to prestige heavy tanks like the Tiger and medium big cat designs like the Panther, and more to the mature, reliable Panzer IV, would its armored forces have been better off? To answer that, we have to step away from the tank museum floor and look at what Germany actually needed from its tanks as the war dragged on. At the start of the war, German armor wasn't built around monsters. In 1939 and 1940, the core of the Panzerwaffe was made up of light and medium tanks, Panzer IIs, IIIs, and Panzer IVs. What made them dangerous wasn't raw firepower and armor thickness, it was how they were used. German doctrine focused on speed, coordination, and concentration. Tanks worked with motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and close air support. Divisions were designed to move quickly, punch through weak spots, and keep going. For that, they needed tanks that were fast enough, reliable enough, and easy enough to maintain. A tank that could be refueled, rearmed, patched up, and sent back out again mattered more than an indestructible giant that rarely made it to the front. But as the war expanded eastward in 1941, the battlefield changed. The Red Army put T-34s and KV-1s into the field, tanks with better armor and, in the T-34's case, clever sloped protection and wide tracks that worked well in mud and snow. The British and Americans later brought Shermans and upgunned Churchills. Everywhere Germany looked, enemy tanks got tougher. At the same time, Germany's own situation was deteriorating. What had begun as a fast-moving war of maneuver had turned into a grinding war of attrition. By 1943, German armored units were fighting on multiple fronts at once, under growing Allied air superiority, and with dwindling supplies of fuel, steel, and experienced crews. In that environment, what did Germany actually need from its tanks? It didn't just need better guns or thicker armor. It needed numbers of operational tanks at critical points. It needed vehicles that could be produced in quantity, maintained in the field, and kept running on ruined roads and overstretched supply lines. That's the backdrop for the three key players in this story: the Panzer IV, the Panther, and the Tiger. Let's start with the one that almost never headlines the stories. The Panzer IV began life before the war as a support tank. Early versions carried a short-barreled 75mm gun, meant primarily to fire high-explosive shells at infantry, anti-tank guns, and fortifications. It wasn't designed as a dedicated tank killer. That changed when German crews started meeting T-34s and KV-1s in the Soviet Union. The Panzer IV was upgunned with a long 75mm gun capable of punching through much thicker armor. Its own armor was gradually improved. Over the years, it evolved from a humble support vehicle into a genuine medium tank, one that could fight enemy armor and still deliver HE shells for the infantry. Crucially, it did this without a complete reinvention. The basic chassis remained. The factories already knew how to build it. The mechanics already knew how to fix it. The Panzer IV was never glamorous, but it was adaptable. The Panther was something different. It was a response to a shock. German designers, impressed and alarmed by the T-34, tried to create a new generation of medium tank that blended mobility, sloped armor, and a high-velocity gun. The result was the Panther. On paper, it was brilliant. A powerful 75mm gun with excellent armor penetration, well-sloped frontal armor, decent speed, and good cross-country ability. But that leap forward came at a cost. The Panther was more complex than the Panzer IV, with more demanding engineering, more stress on its transmission and final drives, and serious teething troubles in its early versions. It wasn't just another step up. It was a new machine that had to be learned, refined, and supported. And then there was the Tiger. The Tiger I wasn't intended to replace the Panzer IV. It was a heavy tank, a breakthrough weapon. It carried the famous 88mm gun, capable of killing most Allied tanks at long range. Its armor was thick and mostly vertical, but extremely difficult to penetrate with standard Allied weapons early on. In a straight-up slugging match, it was terrifying. But it was big, heavy, and expensive. It demanded more steel, more machine time, more fuel. It needed special recovery vehicles when it broke down, and its sheer mass stressed bridges and roads that lighter tanks could use more safely. It was a specialist, powerful, but costly in every sense. On a spec sheet, all three tanks could be justified. But Germany was not designing in a vacuum. For every Tiger or Panther built, something else was not built. That's where the trade-offs begin to bite. To see the scale of those trade-offs, we have to look at production and logistics. Over the course of the war, Germany built roughly 8,500 Panzer IVs, making it one of the most numerous German armored vehicles of the war. Tigers, by contrast, were built in just 1,347 units. The Panther sat in the middle with around 6,000 produced, more numerous than the Tiger, but still far fewer than the Panzer IV. That gap wasn't an accident of taste. It reflected how demanding each design was. A Panzer IV could be produced in less time with less complexity than a Panther or a Tiger. It used fewer exotic materials and fewer highly stressed precision components. It was easier to fit into existing production lines. In a war where Allied bombing campaigns increasingly targeted factories and transportation networks, simplicity had real value. A Tiger or Panther consumed more of everything: labor hours, skilled machinists, high-quality steel, machining capacity, testing, and inspection. That effort wasn't free. If a factory focused on Panthers instead of Panzer IVs, the total number of tanks the army received could drop, even if each individual tank was more powerful. And once those tanks left the factory, the logistics story only got harsher. Heavier tanks drank more fuel per kilometer. They wore out tracks, gearboxes, and engines faster. They needed more spare parts per vehicle, and more recovery vehicles and workshop time when they broke down. Transporting them by rail was harder. Moving them across weak bridges could be risky or impossible. A Tiger on a rail car or in a workshop was not a Tiger in a firing position. Then came the King Tiger, a terrifying tank on paper, but a luxury Germany couldn't afford in 1944. Only around 489 were built, and each one consumed enormous industrial effort for a machine that was heavy, fuel-hungry, and hard to keep running. At that stage of the war, Germany didn't need a bigger Tiger. It needed more usable tanks, faster. The resources poured into King Tigers could have gone into building and sustaining more Panzer IVs, the kind of tank Germany actually had the capacity to field in numbers. Every time Germany chose a design that was heavier and more complex than the Panzer IV, it was choosing to load more strain onto a supply system already under pressure from Allied bombing, shrinking resource access, and the sheer distance of the Eastern Front. In other words, tanks are not just battlefield choices, they are economic choices. But building them is only half the problem. We also have to ask, how many of these vehicles were actually running when it mattered? This is where reliability and availability start to erode the glamour of the big cats. Both the Panther and the Tiger, especially in their early service, suffered from serious mechanical issues. The Panther's transmission and final drive were under high stress. The Tiger's weight punished its drivetrain and suspension. Complex systems meant more things to go wrong and more hours to fix them. Maintenance crews could and did improve matters over time. Later Panthers were more reliable than early ones. Crews learned how to operate them more gently, and units stocked better spare parts. But the basic reality remained. They were demanding machines. The Panzer IV, by contrast, was a mature design. It had been in service since the early war, and its layout and systems were well understood. Its upgrades were evolutionary, not revolutionary. Field workshops knew how to strip it down and rebuild it. Spare parts were more familiar, and logistics chains for it were well established. The difference showed up on strength reports. A unit with 40 Panthers on paper might find that only half or even fewer were fully operational at a given moment, especially in harsh conditions. The rest would be in various states of repair, waiting on parts, or stuck with mobility issues. A Tiger unit, with even fewer tanks to start with, could see its combat power fluctuate wildly as breakdowns and recoveries played out. A unit built around Panzer IVs, while far from immune to mechanical problems, generally had higher percentages of its vehicles ready to fight. They were easier to keep running, easier to fix, and less dependent on fragile components. On the front line, commanders didn't fight with the number of tanks written in the battalion table of organization. They fought with the number that could actually start their engines that morning. On paper, Germany's late-war armored forces looked formidable, with Panthers and Tigers scattered across divisions and independent battalions. On the ground, the story was more uneven. Impressive vehicles, often available in frustratingly small numbers, surrounded by more modest machines that did most of the day-to-day work. So how did those trade-offs play out once the shooting started? In combat, the strengths of Tigers and Panthers were real and frightening. In open country with good fields of fire, a Tiger in a hull-down position could dominate approaches. Its 88mm gun outranged most Allied tank guns early on, allowing it to knock out enemy vehicles before they could reply effectively. Allied crews who faced it remembered the experience vividly, and often with dread. The Panther, with its high-velocity 75mm gun and sloped frontal armor, could do something similar. When used defensively, positioned to face the enemy frontally, it could be very hard to kill and extremely lethal at range. In the right circumstances, small numbers of Panthers or Tigers could inflict disproportionate losses. That's the story the myths remember. But there is another story, one level higher. For every spectacular engagement where a handful of big cats racked up impressive kill counts, there were many more days of routine battle where units needed tanks simply to be present, to support infantry, to cover retreats, to plug gaps, to counterattack, to respond quickly to unexpected Allied thrusts. In those roles, numbers and availability mattered more than raw overmatch. A panzer division that had a few Tigers but many Panzer IVs could use its heavies as fire brigades or strongpoints, but the Panzer IVs would still be the ones holding the line, escorting columns, and fighting countless skirmishes. They were the tanks that could be everywhere the division needed them every day, or at least more often than the heavy, temperamental big cats. And when fighting devolved into close terrain, cities, forests, bocage, the advantage of extreme long-range firepower shrank. Side shots, ambushes, and artillery barrages punished all tanks, no matter how thick their front armor was. In those environments, a simpler, lighter tank that was cheaper to replace had its own logic. So at the micro level, at the level of individual duels and local actions, Tigers and Panthers were often superior. At the macro level, across entire campaigns, the ability to field more serviceable tanks, like the Panzer IV, often mattered just as much, if not more. That brings us back to the counterfactual. What if Germany had leaned much harder into the Panzer IV and much less into Tigers and Panthers? We'll never know for certain, but we can sketch the likely trade-offs. In a scenario where Germany put more emphasis on Panzer IV production and fewer resources into Panthers and Tigers, several things might have happened. First, German armored units might have received more tanks overall. With a simpler, more established design dominating the production lines, factories could focus on quantity and incremental improvements, rather than wrestling with new, complex layouts. Second, logistics would almost certainly have been simpler. More units would share the same or similar spare parts. Mechanics could specialize in one main design instead of juggling three. Training schools could concentrate on one vehicle family. Recovery and maintenance planning would be less chaotic. Third, operational strength, the number of running tanks at any given time, might have been higher and more consistent. Instead of a handful of powerful but temperamental machines surrounded by fewer mediums, divisions might have fielded larger numbers of Panzer IVs in working order. That, in turn, could have made German armored reactions more flexible. More medium tanks in more places might have allowed for stronger local counterattacks, more robust defenses, and a greater ability to absorb losses. But there are limits to how far this story can go. No matter how many Panzer IVs Germany built, it still would have faced serious problems. Allied air supremacy, a choking fuel shortage, dwindling access to raw materials, and the sheer weight of Allied and Soviet manpower and industry. By 1944 and 1945, even a perfectly optimized tank program could not cancel out those realities. Allied anti-tank weapons were also improving. Uprated guns, better ammunition, and highly capable guns like the British 17-pounder would still have been deadly to Panzer IVs. More Panzer IVs would not have meant immune Panzer IVs. So the honest answer is probably this: an army built more heavily around the Panzer IV might have been more coherent and sustainable. It might have wasted fewer resources on machines that were impressive but hard to keep running. It might have fielded stronger armored formations for longer. But it would not have reversed the course of a war already lost at the strategic level. That still leaves one final puzzle. If the big cats were so costly and problematic, why do they dominate the story of German armor today? Part of it is simple psychology. Tigers and Panthers were rare, and rarity breeds fascination. Crews who saw them on either side remembered them. Allied tankers who faced a Tiger and survived often told that story for the rest of their lives. Those dramatic encounters made their way into memoirs, official reports, and later popular histories. Another part is appearance. Tigers and Panthers look like boss tanks. Their silhouettes are striking, their guns long, their hulls massive or sharp. They look like the embodiment of German engineering. In museums, visitors flock to them. In games and films, they are obvious stars. Post-war, it was easy for storytellers to wrap German armored warfare in the imagery of these big cats and let the more modest Panzer IV fade into the background. The Tiger and Panther became symbols of German armored prowess, and sometimes wrongly of German technical superiority as a whole. But when we strip away the legend and look at production figures, logistics, readiness reports, and battlefield coverage, a different picture emerges. The Panzer IV, not the Tiger or Panther, was the tank that carried the burden of Germany's armored war from beginning to end. It was the machine that showed up in Poland, France, North Africa, the Soviet Union, Italy, Normandy, and finally in the ruins of the Reich itself. It did that not because it was perfect, but because it was good enough and could be built and maintained in numbers. So, did Germany back the wrong tanks? On a purely tactical level, no one can deny the power of the Tiger and Panther when they worked. In the right spot, on the right day, they were terrifying tank killers and tough nuts to crack. But at the operational and strategic level, Germany poured precious steel, fuel, factory capacity, and engineering talent into prestige machines that were increasingly out of step with the realities of a long, grinding industrial war. The humble Panzer IV, upgraded and built in even greater numbers, might have given its armored units more staying power, more flexibility, and less waste. It would not have changed the final outcome of the war. But it might have changed the way German armored forces fought, and how long they could keep doing so. In that sense, the Tiger and the Panther were as much symbols of Germany's problems as of its strengths. Powerful, impressive, and feared, but ultimately too expensive for a country trying to fight the world. Meanwhile, the Panzer IV just kept rolling. In fact, it kept rolling long after 1945, exported, rebuilt, and used in combat again decades later, including Syrian Panzer IVs fighting in the 1967 Six-Day War, with the type remaining in Syrian service into the early 1970s. And that might be the most important verdict of all. Not the tank that looked the scariest. The tank that could be built, fielded, and sustained again and again.